The morning sun had barely touched the dusty streets of Kandahar when Sarah Mitchell opened her eyes in the small room that had become her prison. The concrete walls were stained with years of neglect, and the single-barred window offered only a narrow view of the world she might never see again. She sat up on the thin mattress, her body aching from another sleepless night filled with nightmares about what was coming. Sarah had arrived in Afghanistan 6 months ago as a humanitarian worker with Global Aid Network. She was 28 years old, fresh-faced and determined to make a difference in a country torn apart by decades of war. Her colleagues had warned her about the dangers, but Sarah believed in her mission. She wanted to help rebuild schools, provide medical care to remote villages, and bring hope to children who had known nothing but conflict their entire lives. Everything changed 3 weeks ago, when she was returning from a village clinic in the northern province. The convoy of aid workers had been traveling along a rough mountain road when armed militants appeared from nowhere. The attack was swift and brutal. Sarah's driver was shot immediately, and she was dragged from the vehicle while her screams echoed through the valley. The other workers managed to escape, but Sarah wasn't so lucky. The militants belonged to a local warlord named Rashid Khan, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of everyone in the region. He controlled several provinces through violence and intimidation, and he had his own twisted sense of justice. When his men brought Sarah to his compound, he accused her of being a spy for the American military. No matter how much she protested, no matter how many times she explained that she was just a nurse trying to help people, Rashid refused to listen. The trial, if it could even be called that, lasted less than an hour. Sarah was brought before Rashid and a group of his senior commanders in a dusty courtyard. There was no lawyer. No evidence presented, no chance to defend herself properly. Rashid declared that she had been found with communication equipment, which he claimed proved she was gathering intelligence for foreign forces. The fact that it was just a basic satellite phone used by all aid workers meant nothing to him. When Rashid pronounced the death sentence, Sarah felt her world collapse. She would be executed by hanging in the public square as a warning to anyone who dared to work with foreigners. The date was set for 7 days from the trial. 7 days to live, 7 days to hope for a miracle that seemed impossible. Sarah spent those days in a fog of terror and disbelief. She tried to maintain her composure, tried to pray, tried to find some inner strength, but the reality of her situation was crushing. She thought about her family back in Oregon, her mother who had begged her not to go to Afghanistan, her younger brother who looked up to her, and her father who had served in the military and understood the call to serve something bigger than yourself. The guards brought her meals twice a day, usually just rice and bread with some tea. They weren't cruel to her, but they weren't kind either. They simply treated her as someone who was already dead, whose fate was sealed. One young guard, barely 18 years old, would sometimes linger at her door, looking at her with something like pity in his eyes, but he never spoke to her. On the 6th day, Sarah heard whispers among the guards. Something was happening, something unusual. There were mentions of American soldiers nearby, of negotiations, of movements in the night. But Sarah had learned not to hope too much. Every rumor in this place seemed to lead nowhere, and she couldn't bear another disappointment. That evening, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah was told to prepare herself. Tomorrow morning at dawn, she would be taken to the square. The execution would proceed as planned. She spent that final night sitting by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, wondering if there was any chance, any possibility that someone was coming for her. Meanwhile, 90 miles away at a forward operating base, Colonel James Harrison was studying intelligence reports with his team. Harrison was a Navy SEAL with 20 years of experience, a man who had seen more combat than most people could imagine. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with gray beginning to show in his close-cropped hair and lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting in the desert sun. His men respected him not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home. The intelligence about Sarah Mitchell had reached Harrison's desk 3 days ago. At first, it seemed like another hostage situation in a region full of them. But something about this case bothered him. An innocent aid worker, falsely accused, sentenced to death by a warlord who operated with impunity. It wasn't just wrong. It was an injustice that Harrison couldn't ignore. He had immediately requested permission to mount a rescue operation, But the bureaucracy moved slowly. There were political considerations, diplomatic channels to explore, risks to weigh. But Harrison knew that time was running out. He had seen too many cases where hesitation led to tragedy. He made a decision that only a man with his experience and reputation could make. He would go after Sarah Mitchell, with or without official approval. Harrison assembled a team of 12 of his best operators. They were men who had worked together for years, who trusted each other with their lives, who could operate in the dark behind enemy lines with precision and silence. In the briefing room, Harrison laid out the plan. It was risky, perhaps even reckless by conventional standards, but it was their only chance to save Sarah before dawn. The plan involved a nighttime insertion by helicopter to a position 5 miles from Rashid's compound. From there, they would move on foot through hostile territory, locate Sarah, extract her, and get to an extraction point before the warlord's forces could respond. It required perfect timing, perfect execution, and more than a little luck. As the helicopters lifted off into the night sky, their rotors beating against the darkness, Harrison felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and focus that came before every mission. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Sarah Mitchell was counting down her final hours, unaware that a team of America's finest warriors was racing against time to save her life. The helicopters dropped Harrison and his team in a rocky valley surrounded by mountains that rose like dark giants against the starlit sky. The moment their boots hit the ground, the aircraft lifted off and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the rocks. The SEAL team moved immediately, spreading out in a tactical formation that had been practiced 1,000 times. Harrison checked his GPS and night vision equipment. They had exactly 4 hours to reach the compound, locate Sarah, and get her out before dawn broke and the execution was scheduled to begin. Every minute counted, and Harrison could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. The team moved through the darkness like shadows, covering ground quickly but carefully. This was enemy territory, and Rashid Khan had fighters scattered throughout the region. One wrong step, one noise at the wrong moment, and their mission would turn into a firefight that could get them all killed. Harrison had briefed his men thoroughly. This was a rescue operation, not an assault. They would avoid engagement if possible, use stealth over force, and prioritize getting Sarah out alive above everything else. Lieutenant Marcus Chen moved beside Harrison, his weapon at the ready. Chen was the youngest member of the team, but one of the sharpest tacticians Harrison had ever worked with. He had a gift for reading terrain and anticipating threats before they materialized. Behind them, the rest of the team followed in perfect silence, each man covering a different sector, each one ready to respond to danger in an instant. As they climbed through a narrow pass between 2 ridges, Harrison raised his fist, signaling the team to stop. His night vision had picked up movement ahead. 2 figures, probably sentries, were positioned on a rocky outcrop overlooking the path. Harrison gestured to Chen and another operator, Rodriguez. Within seconds, the 2 SEALs had circled around, approaching the sentries from behind with the silence of hunting cats. Harrison watched through his scope as Chen and Rodriguez reached the sentries. There was a brief struggle, muffled sounds, and then silence. The path was clear. Harrison felt a grim satisfaction, but no pleasure. These men were likely just poor farmers forced to work for Rashid, but there was no choice. Sarah's life depended on their success. The team continued moving, always keeping to the shadows, always listening for any sign of alarm. They passed through small villages where dogs barked in the distance and cooking fires glowed in windows. Normal people living their lives, unaware that foreign soldiers were moving through their land like ghosts in the night. Harrison wondered what they would think if they knew, whether they would see them as saviors or invaders. After 2 hours of hard movement, they reached a position on a hillside overlooking Rashid Khan's compound. Harrison pulled out his binoculars and studied the target. The compound was larger than the intelligence photos had suggested, with high walls, guard towers, and what looked like at least 20 armed men on patrol. The main building was a 2-story structure in the center, and Harrison knew that was where Rashid would be sleeping, confident in his power and protection. But where was Sarah? Harrison scanned every building, every courtyard, looking for any sign of where they might be holding her. Then he saw it. A small building at the far corner of the compound, isolated from the others, with a single guard posted outside the door. That had to be it. The location made sense. Keep the prisoner away from the main activity. Easy to control but hard to reach. Harrison called his team together in a tight circle and outlined the plan in whispered tones. They would split into 3 groups. One team, led by Chen, would create a diversion on the far side of the compound to draw the guards away. Another team would provide overwatch from their current position, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. Harrison would lead the third team directly to Sarah's location for the extraction. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and they would be detected before reaching Sarah. Too late and they would run out of darkness. Harrison checked his watch. 3:30 in the morning. They had 1 hour until dawn began to break. 1 hour to pull off a miracle. At Harrison's signal, Chen's team moved out, circling around to the far side of the compound. Harrison watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned to his own team. There were 4 of them for the extraction. Harrison, Rodriguez, a medic named Thompson, and a communications specialist named Jackson. Each man knew his role, knew what had to happen. They waited, every second stretching like an hour. Then, exactly on schedule, Harrison heard the explosion. Chen's team had detonated a small charge on the far side of the compound, just enough to sound like an attack. Immediately, lights came on throughout the compound, and Harrison could see guards running toward the explosion, shouting and firing their weapons into the darkness. This was their moment. Harrison led his team down the hillside, moving fast but staying low. They reached the outer wall and used climbing equipment to scale it quickly. On the other side, they dropped into shadows and moved toward the small building where Sarah was held. The guard who had been posted there had abandoned his position to join the others in responding to the diversion. Harrison reached the door and tried the handle. Locked. Rodriguez moved forward with a small explosive charge, placing it carefully on the lock. They all stepped back, and with a muffled bang, the door swung open. Inside, Sarah sat on her mattress, her eyes wide with shock and fear. She had been awakened by the explosion and the chaos outside, and now she was staring at 4 armed men in full combat gear, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles and tactical masks. For a moment, Harrison saw the terror in her eyes, saw her shrink back against the wall. Harrison pulled off his mask and spoke quickly, his voice calm but urgent. He told her who they were, that they were Americans, that they had come to get her out. For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, unable to process what was happening. Was this real? Was this another dream, another cruel trick her mind was playing on her? Then Thompson, the medic, stepped forward with a gentle voice, speaking in the kind of tone you would use with a frightened child. He told her his name, told her they were going home, told her she was safe now. Something in his voice broke through Sarah's shock. Tears began streaming down her face as the realization hit her. She was being rescued. She was going to live. But there was no time for relief or celebration. Harrison could hear the compound coming alive around them, voices shouting, orders being given. Soon, Rashid would realize the explosion was a diversion, and his men would start searching for what they had really come for. Harrison helped Sarah to her feet and quickly explained what would happen next. They needed to move fast and stay quiet. Her life still depended on getting out of this compound before they were discovered. Sarah's legs felt weak as Harrison pulled her to her feet. 3 weeks of captivity, poor food, and constant fear had taken their toll on her body. But adrenaline was flooding her system now, giving her strength she didn't know she still had. Thompson quickly checked her over, looking for injuries or signs that she couldn't make the journey out. Aside from being thin and exhausted, she seemed physically capable of moving. Harrison handed her a radio headset and helped her adjust it. He needed her to be able to hear their commands as they moved. Then he gave her a quick briefing in hushed tones. They would move as a unit through the compound, staying in shadows, avoiding contact when possible. If shooting started, she was to get down immediately and let them handle it. Most importantly, she needed to trust them completely and do exactly what they said without hesitation. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. These men had risked their lives to come for her, a stranger they had never met. The realization was overwhelming, but there was no time to process it. Harrison was already moving toward the door, checking outside before signaling the others to follow. They moved out into the compound, staying close to the walls and buildings. The chaos on the far side was still continuing, with gunfire and shouting echoing through the night. Chen's team was doing their job perfectly, keeping the attention focused away from where Harrison and his group were operating. But Harrison knew the diversion couldn't last much longer. Someone would eventually realize there was no real threat and start looking for what was missing. As they moved through a narrow alley between two buildings, Sarah stumbled on loose rocks. Rodriguez caught her before she fell, steadying her with a strong hand. He gave her an encouraging nod through his tactical gear, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward these silent warriors who had appeared like guardian angels in her darkest hour. They were halfway across an open courtyard when lights suddenly flooded the area. Someone had found the empty cell. Shouts in Pashto filled the air, and Harrison could hear Rashid Khan's voice above all others, screaming orders to find the prisoner, to lock down the compound, to kill anyone who stood in their way. Harrison made a split-second decision. Stealth was no longer an option. He pressed his radio and gave the command his Overwatch team had been waiting for. Immediately, suppressing fire rained down from the hillside where his snipers were positioned. Guards who had been running toward them dove for cover, giving Harrison's team precious seconds to move. They ran across the courtyard with Sarah in the middle of their formation, each seal covering a different direction. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet, and Sarah heard the crack of rounds passing close to her head. Terror threatened to freeze her in place, but Harrison's hand on her back kept her moving forward. His voice in her headset was calm and steady, telling her to keep going, telling her they were almost there. They reached the compound wall where they had entered, but now there were guards between them and their escape route. Harrison didn't hesitate. He and Rodriguez engaged the guards while Thompson pulled Sarah down behind cover. The firefight was brief but intense. Harrison's training and experience showed in every movement, every shot placed with precision. Within seconds, the guards were down and the path was clear. Rodriguez threw up a rope and Jackson scaled the wall first, pulling security on the other side. Then Thompson helped Sarah climb, with Harrison pushing from below. Her hands were shaking, her muscles screaming in protest, but somehow she made it over. On the other side, Jackson caught her as she dropped down, breaking her fall. Harrison and Rodriguez came over the wall last, just as more guards arrived at their position. Bullets sparked off the stone wall above their heads, but they were over and running before the guards could get a clear shot. The team moved fast away from the compound, but they weren't safe yet. Harrison could hear vehicles starting up behind them. Rashid was mobilizing his entire force to hunt them down. Chen's team joined them at a predetermined rally point, and now the full SEAL team was moving together through the darkness. Sarah ran with them, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning with effort. She had never run so hard in her life, but she pushed through the pain, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death for all of them. They reached the extraction point, a flat area in the valley where helicopters could land. But there was a problem. The extraction wasn't scheduled for another 20 minutes, and they could see the lights of vehicles approaching from the compound. Rashid's forces were closing in fast, and they would be here long before the helicopters arrived. Harrison quickly assessed the situation. They needed to buy time, to hold this position against superior numbers until their ride arrived. He positioned his men in a defensive perimeter, using whatever cover the terrain offered. Sarah was placed in the center, protected by the SEALs on all sides. Thompson stayed close to her, his medical training making him the logical choice to keep her safe while the others fought. The first vehicles appeared, and immediately the SEALs opened fire. Their training and superior night vision equipment gave them a huge advantage, but they were still outnumbered at least 4-1. Harrison called for air support, but he knew it would take time to arrive. They were on their own for now. The firefight was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The noise was deafening, the muzzle flashes blinding in the darkness. She pressed herself flat against the ground, covering her ears, praying that the men protecting her would survive. She could hear Harrison calling out targets, coordinating his team's fire, his voice never losing its calm authority even as chaos erupted around them. Rodriguez was hit in the shoulder but kept fighting, his training allowing him to push through the pain and continue engaging the enemy. Chen was performing miracles on the left flank, his accurate fire keeping an entire group of fighters pinned down. Jackson was feeding Harrison constant updates on ammunition levels and enemy positions, his technical skills proving as valuable as any weapon. Sarah saw one of the SEALs, a man whose name she didn't even know, take a round to his body armor that knocked him backward. But he was up again in seconds, returning fire as if nothing had happened. These men were incredible, and they were fighting this hard for her, a civilian they had never met before tonight. Harrison checked his watch. 15 minutes until extraction. They had to hold for 15 more minutes. His ammunition was running low, and he knew the others were in the same situation. This was going to come down to the wire, and he hoped their luck would hold just a little bit longer. Then, like music from heaven, Harrison heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. But his relief was short-lived. The helicopters were still 2 minutes out, and Rashid's forces were preparing for a final assault. Harrison could see them massing in the darkness, getting ready to overrun the SEAL position before the extraction could happen. Harrison made another decision, one that defined who he was as a leader. He ordered Chen to take half the team and Sarah to the landing zone, which was about 50 meters away. He would stay with the other half to hold off the assault and buy them time to get loaded. Chen started to argue, but Harrison cut him off. This wasn't a discussion. It was an order. Chen grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the landing zone, moving in a crouch with 3 other SEALs providing cover. Sarah looked back at Harrison and the men staying behind, and her heart broke. They were sacrificing themselves to save her, and there was nothing she could do about it. Thompson pushed her forward, his voice urgent in her ear, telling her to move, telling her that Harrison knew what he was doing. The helicopters came in fast and low, their door gunners already laying down suppressive fire. The noise was incredible, the rotor wash kicking up dust and rocks that stung Sarah's face. Chen practically threw her into the first helicopter, then climbed in after her. The other SEALs from his group piled in, and immediately the pilot started to lift off. But Sarah saw Chen grab the pilot's shoulder, shouting something she couldn't hear over the noise. The helicopter didn't leave. Instead, it hovered just above the ground, its guns blazing toward Rashid's position. Chen was refusing to leave without Harrison and the others. Back at the defensive position, Harrison and his remaining men were in the fight of their lives. The final assault had begun, and Rashid's forces were throwing everything they had at the SEALs. Harrison's rifle ran dry and he switched to his sidearm, still calling out targets, still directing his men's fire. Rodriguez, despite his shoulder wound, was performing like a champion, his shots disciplined and accurate. Jackson took a round to the leg and went down. Harrison dragged him behind better cover while continuing to fire with his free hand. The helicopter's door guns were helping, but they couldn't stay on station forever. They were burning fuel and drawing fire themselves. Harrison knew they had to move now or never. He gave the order to fall back to the landing zone. The remaining SEALs laid down covering fire for each other, leapfrogging backward in a tactical retreat that was as dangerous as any advance. Harrison was the last to move, making sure every one of his men was ahead of him before he started his own run to the helicopter. He was 10 meters from the aircraft when he felt something slam into his side. The force spun him around and he went down hard. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. He could see the helicopter, could see Chen jumping out to come for him, could see Sarah's horrified face in the door. He tried to get up, but his body wasn't responding properly. Then Rodriguez was there, and Thompson lifting him bodily and running for the helicopter. Harrison wanted to tell them to leave him, to save themselves, but he couldn't seem to form the words. The world was getting fuzzy around the edges, and he realized he had been hit worse than he thought. They threw Harrison into the helicopter, and the pilot didn't wait another second. The aircraft lifted off hard, banking away from the landing zone as bullets rattled against its armored belly. Sarah was pushed aside as Thompson immediately began working on Harrison, cutting away his tactical vest to get to the wound. Blood was everywhere, and Sarah could see the fear in Thompson's eyes even as he worked with practiced efficiency. Harrison was fading in and out of consciousness, but he managed to focus on his team, counting heads, making sure everyone had made it out. His lips moved and Chen leaned close to hear. Harrison was asking about casualties, about his men, always thinking about them even as his own life bled away. Chen assured him everyone was alive, everyone was on the helicopters. Only then did Harrison seem to relax slightly. He turned his head and saw Sarah, saw her tears, saw her reaching out to hold his hand. He managed a weak smile and whispered something that Sarah had to lean close to hear over the helicopter noise. He told her it was worth it, that she was worth it, that this was what they did, what they had trained their whole lives to do, saving innocent lives, standing against evil, making sure that people like Rashid Khan didn't win. Then his eyes closed, and for a terrifying moment Sarah thought he was gone. But Thompson was shouting that he had a pulse, that Harrison was still fighting. The medic worked frantically, calling out for supplies, for assistance from the other SEALs who had medical training. The helicopter pushed its engines to maximum speed, racing toward the forward operating base where a trauma team was waiting. Sarah held Harrison's hand throughout the flight, praying harder than she had ever prayed in her life. This man, this stranger who had risked everything for her, couldn't die. Not now. Not after coming so far, after saving her from the gallows. She talked to him even though she didn't know if he could hear, telling him to hold on, telling him he had to make it, telling him she would never forget what he had done. The flight seemed to take forever, but finally, the base appeared in the distance, lights blazing in the darkness. The helicopter landed hard on the medical pad, and a team of doctors and nurses rushed out with a stretcher. They transferred Harrison carefully, and Thompson gave them a rapid briefing on his injuries and the treatment he had provided. Sarah tried to follow, but Chen gently held her back. Harrison was in the best hands now, he told her. What she needed was medical attention herself, food, water, and rest. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to stay with Harrison and make sure he survived, but exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave. Her legs gave out, and Chen caught her before she hit the ground. She woke up in a clean bed in a medical facility, sunlight streaming through a window. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back. The rescue, the firefight, Harrison bleeding in the helicopter. She sat up quickly, ignoring the dizziness that swept over her. A nurse came in immediately, smiling with relief to see Sarah awake. She had been unconscious for 16 hours, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion and trauma of the past weeks. The nurse assured her she was safe, that she was at a secure military facility, and that arrangements were being made to send her home to the United States. Sarah's first question was about Harrison. The nurse's expression grew serious and Sarah's heart sank. But then the nurse smiled and told her that Colonel Harrison had survived surgery and was in stable condition. It had been touch and go for a while, but his strength and conditioning had saved him. He was going to make a full recovery. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. She asked if she could see him, but the nurse explained he was still in intensive care and not allowed visitors yet. However, she said that Harrison had sent a message for Sarah when he woke up briefly after surgery. The message was simple but profound. He wanted her to know that she should go home, rebuild her life, and not feel guilty about what happened. He and his men had done their jobs, and they would all be fine. Over the next few days, Sarah was debriefed by military intelligence and State Department officials. Her story made international news, though the details of the rescue operation remained classified for national security reasons. She learned more about Harrison and his team, about their incredible service records, about the risks they had taken not just for her but for countless others over the years. She also learned about the aftermath at Rashid Khan's compound. The warlord had escaped in the chaos, but his operation had been severely disrupted. The publicity from Sarah's rescue had brought international attention to the region, and pressure was mounting on local authorities to deal with Rashid's criminal enterprise. While he hadn't been captured, his power had been significantly diminished. 5 days after the rescue, Sarah was finally allowed to visit Harrison. She was nervous as she walked through the medical ward, unsure what she would say to the man who had saved her life. How do you thank someone for something like that? What words could possibly be adequate? Harrison was sitting up in bed when she entered, his torso wrapped in bandages but his eyes clear and alert. Several of his team members were there too, including Chen, Rodriguez with his arm in a sling, and Thompson. They all stood when Sarah entered, and she felt overwhelmed by their presence. These warriors who had fought so hard for her. Harrison smiled when he saw her, and Sarah noticed how different he looked without his tactical gear. He seemed younger somehow, more approachable. His gray-flecked hair was disheveled, and there was actual color in his face instead of the deathly pallor she had seen on the helicopter. Sarah didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth to thank him, to try to express her gratitude, but Harrison raised his hand gently to stop her. He told her there was no need for thanks, that he and his men had simply done what they were trained to do. But Sarah could see in his eyes that it meant more to him than he was letting on. This wasn't just another mission to him. Every person saved was a victory against the darkness, a reason to keep fighting. They talked for over an hour, and Sarah learned about Harrison's background. He had grown up in a small town in Montana, joined the Navy at 18, and worked his way up through sheer determination and skill. He had been a SEAL for nearly 2 decades, seen combat in multiple countries, and led countless operations. But he spoke about his career with humility, always crediting his team, always deflecting praise to others. Sarah told him about her own background, about growing up in Oregon, becoming a nurse, and feeling called to help people in war-torn regions. She talked about the villages she had visited, the children she had treated, the hope she had seen even in the darkest places. Harrison listened intently, and Sarah could see understanding in his eyes. Despite their different paths, they shared a common belief in service, in helping others, and standing up against injustice. As their conversation continued, the other SEALs shared their own stories. Rodriguez talked about his family in Texas, Chen about his immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, Thompson about becoming a medic because he wanted to save lives instead of just taking them. Sarah realized these weren't just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, friends, human beings who had chosen a dangerous path because they believed it was the right thing to do. When it was time for Sarah to leave, Harrison asked her about her plans. Was she going back to humanitarian work? Sarah admitted she wasn't sure. The experience had shaken her deeply, and she didn't know if she could face that kind of danger again. Part of her wanted to go home, to be safe, to never leave the United States again. Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then shared something personal. He told her about his own moments of doubt, times when he had questioned whether the danger was worth it, whether he was making a real difference. But he always came back to the same conclusion. Evil existed in the world, and good people had a responsibility to fight it. If people like him and Sarah didn't step up, who would? His words resonated with Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't telling her what to do or pressuring her to continue her humanitarian work. He was simply sharing his own philosophy, his own reason for continuing despite the risks. Sarah left the medical ward with much to think about. The following week, Sarah was cleared to return to the United States. A military transport would take her to Germany, then a commercial flight home to Oregon. On her last night at the base, there was a small gathering in her honor. The SEAL team was there, along with other personnel who had been involved in her rescue and recovery. The base commander, a stern-looking general, gave a brief speech about courage and sacrifice. He presented Sarah with a unit coin, a military tradition meant to show respect and recognition. Sarah was moved by the gesture, understanding that these men were accepting her as one of their own, someone who had faced danger and survived. But the most meaningful moment came when Harrison, still moving carefully due to his injury, stood to speak. He talked about the mission, about the split-second decisions and the teamwork that made it successful. But then he shifted his focus to Sarah herself. He spoke about the strength he had seen in her eyes even in captivity, the courage she had shown during the escape, and the dignity she had maintained throughout her ordeal. Harrison said that people often thought of courage as something that belonged to soldiers, but he knew better. Courage came in many forms. Sarah had traveled to one of the most dangerous places on Earth to help people she didn't know, people who couldn't repay her, and that took a special kind of bravery. The world needed more people like her, more people willing to risk everything to make a difference. His words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Throughout her captivity, she had felt weak, helpless, like a victim who needed rescuing. But Harrison was telling her she was strong, that her work mattered, that she was a warrior in her own right. It was exactly what she needed to hear. The next morning, Sarah said her goodbyes. She hugged each member of the SEAL team, thanking them individually for their role in saving her life. Chen told her to stay safe and keep making a difference. Rodriguez joked that she owed them all a beer if they ever made it to the States. Thompson pressed a card into her hand with his email address, telling her to reach out if she ever needed anything. Her final goodbye was with Harrison. They stood together in the early morning light, neither one quite sure what to say. Finally, Harrison spoke. He told her that saving her had been one of the proudest moments of his career, not because it was a difficult mission or a tactical success, but because she represented everything they were fighting for: innocent people trying to make the world better, people who deserved protection and support. Sarah told him she would never forget him, never forget any of them. She promised that whatever path she chose, She would honor their sacrifice by living a life that mattered. Harrison smiled and told her that was all he could ask for. As the transport plane lifted off from the base, Sarah looked out the window at the rugged Afghan landscape below. Somewhere down there, people were still suffering, still living in fear under men like Rashid Khan. But somewhere down there, people like Harrison and his team were still fighting, still refusing to let evil win. And somewhere down there, other aid workers were continuing the mission, helping those who couldn't help themselves. The flight to Germany took several hours, and Sarah spent much of it reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the moment when the noose was meant to go around her neck, how close she had come to death. She thought about Harrison cutting through the compound to reach her, risking everything for a stranger. She thought about the firefight, the helicopter ride, and Harrison bleeding in her arms. But she also thought about the children she had treated in Afghan villages, their smiles when they received medicine or school supplies. She thought about the mothers who had thanked her with tears in their eyes for helping their sick babies. She thought about the schools they had rebuilt, the wells they had dug, the lives they had touched. That work had meaning. That work mattered. In Germany, during her layover, Sarah called her mother. The conversation was emotional, with her mother sobbing with relief to hear her voice. Sarah's family had been through hell during her captivity. Not knowing if she was alive or dead, powerless to help her, her mother begged her to come home and never leave again, to take a safe job in a local hospital where nothing could hurt her. Sarah couldn't promise that. She told her mother she needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. But she also told her something she had realized during her conversations with Harrison. She couldn't live her life in fear. If she did, then Rashid Khan would have won. He would have succeeded in silencing her, in stopping her from helping others, and she refused to give him that victory. The final flight to Oregon was long, but Sarah barely noticed. She was exhausted but also energized by a new sense of purpose. She didn't know exactly what her future held, but she knew she wasn't done making a difference. Harrison and his team had given her a second chance at life, and she was determined not to waste it. When the plane landed in Portland, Sarah's entire family was waiting for her. Her mother, father, and younger brother rushed forward as she came through the gate. The reunion was tearful and joyful. Everyone talking at once, everyone just grateful to have her home safe. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt truly secure, surrounded by the love of her family. Over the following weeks, Sarah stayed with her parents while she recovered physically and emotionally from her ordeal. She attended therapy sessions to deal with the trauma, and slowly she began to feel like herself again. But something had changed inside her. She was no longer the naive young woman who had gone to Afghanistan with stars in her eyes. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best. Sarah stayed in touch with Thompson through email, and through him she received updates on Harrison's recovery. The colonel was healing well and would soon return to active duty. His team had already been deployed on another mission, always moving, always fig 2 years past, and Sarah's life had found a new rhythm. She was working in Colombia now, helping communities affected by decades of internal conflict. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she felt like she was finally making the kind of impact she had always dreamed of. The trauma of Afghanistan had faded, though it never completely disappeared. Some nights she still woke up in a cold sweat, dreaming of the gallows or the sound of bullets whistling past her head. But those moments were becoming less frequent. Sarah had learned to channel her experiences into strength rather than fear. She trained other humanitarian workers in security protocols, sharing lessons from her own ordeal to help keep others safe. She spoke at conferences about the importance of protecting aid workers in conflict zones, and she never forgot the men who had saved her life. Sarah had kept in touch with Thompson through email, and occasionally she heard news about the SEAL team. Rodriguez had retired and was working with a veterans organization. Chen had been promoted and was now leading his own team. Jackson was training new communication specialists. They were all doing well, continuing their service in different ways, but Harrison remained somewhat of a mystery. Thompson's updates about him were vague, usually just mentioning that the colonel was deployed somewhere classified. Sarah understood. Men like Harrison didn't retire to quiet lives. They stayed in the fight until the fight was over, and for someone like him, the fight was never really over. Then one day, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from the Department of Defense asking if she would be willing to participate in a ceremony in Washington, D.C. Harrison and his team were being recognized for their service, and they had specifically requested that Sarah be present. She didn't hesitate. She booked a flight immediately. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, a formal military affair with dignitaries and high-ranking officers. Sarah felt out of place in her simple dress among all the uniforms and medals. But when she saw Harrison and his team, all those feelings vanished. They looked older, more weathered, but their eyes still held that same determination and strength she remembered. Harrison saw her and broke into a genuine smile, something Sarah suspected he didn't do often. He walked over to her, moving with only a slight stiffness from his old wound. They embraced like old friends, and Sarah was struck by how good it felt to see him again. This man had been there at her lowest moment, had literally saved her from death, and seeing him healthy and whole filled her with joy. The ceremony itself was impressive. Harrison and his team received commendations for their bravery and service, not just for Sarah's rescue but for years of operations that had saved countless lives. The Secretary of Defense spoke about their dedication, their sacrifice, and their unwavering commitment to protecting American citizens and interests around the world. But the most moving moment came when Harrison was asked to speak. He stood at the podium, looking uncomfortable with the attention, and spoke briefly about his team and their mission. Then he did something unexpected. He asked Sarah to join him at the podium. Sarah was surprised but walked up to stand beside him. Harrison turned to the audience and told them Sarah's story, not dwelling on the dramatic rescue but focusing on why she had been in Afghanistan in the first place. He talked about her courage in traveling to a war zone to help others, her dignity during captivity, and her determination to continue humanitarian work even after her ordeal. Then Harrison said something that took everyone by surprise, including Sarah. He said that while his team had saved Sarah's life, she had saved something equally important for them. She had reminded them why they did what they did. In a job that often involved darkness and violence, Sarah represented the light they were fighting to protect. Every person like her, every aid worker, teacher, or doctor who went to dangerous places to help others, was proof that humanity was worth defending. Harrison turned to Sarah and said that the medal he was receiving meant less to him than knowing she was out there, continuing to make a difference. He said she was the real hero, and people like her were the reason people like him kept fighting. The audience erupted in applause, and Sarah found herself crying, overwhelmed by his words. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Sarah got to catch up with all the team members. Rodriguez showed her pictures of his children. Chen talked about the young SEALs he was training. Thompson shared stories about the lives he had saved as a combat medic. Each of them had continued on their path of service, and each of them seemed at peace with the choices they had made. But it was her conversation with Harrison that meant the most to Sarah. They found a quiet corner away from the crowd, and for the first time, they talked not as a soldier and the person he rescued, but as two people who had shared an extraordinary experience and come out changed by it. Harrison admitted something he had never told anyone else. The night of Sarah's rescue had been one of the most difficult of his career, not because of the tactical challenges, but because of the weight of responsibility. Knowing that an innocent person would die if they failed had pushed him and his team to their absolute limits. When he saw Sarah alive in that helicopter, when he knew she would make it home, it had felt like redemption for every mission that hadn't gone perfectly, for every person he hadn't been able to save. Sarah told him that he had given her more than just her life. He had given her purpose, shown her that courage came in many forms, and proved that good people still fought against evil. The weeks after her rescue had been the darkest of her life, filled with doubt and fear. But remembering Harrison and his team, remembering their bravery and dedication, had pulled her through. Harrison asked about her work in Colombia, and Sarah's face lit up as she described the projects she was involved in. She talked about a school they had rebuilt, a medical clinic they had established, families they had helped relocate to safer areas. Harrison listened with genuine interest, asking questions, offering insights from his own experiences in conflict zones. Then Sarah asked Harrison the question she had wanted to ask for 2 years. Why had he done it? Why had he risked his life and his team's lives for someone he had never met? There must have been dozens of hostages, hundreds of people in danger. What made him choose her rescue? Harrison was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Then he told her the truth. It wasn't that her situation was more important than others. It was that he had the ability to help, the team to do it, and the will to try. In his line of work, you couldn't save everyone, but you could save someone, and every someone mattered. Every life had value. If he had the chance to save a life and didn't take it, he couldn't live with himself. He also admitted something else. Reading Sarah's file, learning about her humanitarian work had reminded him of his sister. She had been a teacher in an inner-city school, dedicating her life to helping disadvantaged children. She had died in a car accident 10 years ago, and Harrison still felt her loss deeply. Maybe on some level, saving Sarah had been about honoring his sister's memory, about protecting someone who shared her same spirit of service. Sarah was moved by his honesty. She told Harrison about her own motivations, about growing up comfortable and safe and feeling like she owed something to the world, about believing that those who had been given much had a responsibility to give back, about wanting to be part of something bigger than herself. They talked for hours, and gradually Sarah realized something. She and Harrison weren't so different. They had chosen different paths, different ways of serving, but they were driven by the same core beliefs. They both believed in standing up for what was right, in protecting the vulnerable, in fighting against injustice wherever it appeared. They were kindred spirits united by a shared sense of purpose. As the reception wound down, Harrison walked Sarah out to her car. The evening air was cool, and Washington, D.C. was beautiful in the twilight. They stood together for a moment, neither wanting to say goodbye but knowing they had to. Their lives would take them in different directions again, to different continents, different missions, different battles. But before Sarah left, Harrison made her a promise. He told her that as long as he was able, as long as there were people like her out there trying to make the world better, he would be there to protect them. Not because it was his job, but because it was his calling, and he made her promise something in return. That she would keep doing her work, keep helping others, keep being the light in dark places, Sarah promised, and they embraced one final time. Then she got in her car and drove away, watching Harrison in her rearview mirror until he disappeared from sight. She knew it might be years before she saw him again, if ever, but she also knew that somewhere in the world, when innocent people were in danger, men like Harrison would be there. Silent guardians, willing to risk everything to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. 6 months later, Sarah was working in a remote Colombian village when she received a package. Inside was a photograph from the Pentagon ceremony, showing her and Ha